I've been using Red Sea Reef Energy AB Plus for 18 months now, so today I'll tell you about the practical side of using it, the problems I've experienced, and crucially, whether it's improved my corals' health, growth and colour. Now Red Sea gave me the first bottle for free, but since then I've bought all subsequent bottles myself, and I'll link a card to the first impressions video I did at the top corner of the screen. What I had in mind for this video was a series of before and after shots showing you just how much my corals have grown, and the clips you're seeing now were filmed 2 months apart when I first got the stuff and was dosing it every day. And I dosed every day for around 4 months at first, but since then I've only ever dosed AB Plus on and off because I've always been concerned it was contributing to various problems I've had in my tank. Now I'll tell you more about that later, but first off let's take a look at it in action. It's a really bright yellow colour, and I find it gives the full-on Chernobyl fallout effect under blue LEDs. Now obviously this isn't a reason to buy the stuff, but I can't overstate just how cool it looks, and I love watching it shroud over my corals like a sunset mist of juicy goodness. Although you only get that effect if you add it by hand with all your flow pumps turned off. If you add it using a doser or with your return pump or power heads turned on, it dissipates instantly and you don't see the effect. When I add Reef Energy, I find my SPS corals show their feeding tentacles, which look like dozens of fine pieces of string, which you can see on the underside of this particular aquapora. But not all of my SPS corals respond, and many act like nothing's happening. And for that reason, when I fed the stuff on a doser, I tried to do so at night when the corals were already in feed mode with their polyps primed and ready for action. Now while my SPS corals do exhibit some feeding reaction, I get a much stronger reaction from my LPS corals, the best example of which can be seen in my scalemias. They pretty much fold inside out, and I take that as a sign they very much like what they smell. Although I would say that doesn't always happen, and it took me 6 attempts at filming to get these particular shots, so don't expect to see this display every time you feed. So what about growth then? In the year and a half I've been using Reef Energy Plus, my corals have grown really nicely. In particular my SPS corals and most of my zoas. Now I've removed several fast growing SPS corals in that time, but many of my smaller aquapora corals are now full grown colonies. However, I can't say much of that at all is down to Reef Energy Plus, given how infrequently I've been using it recently. And it goes to show that corals will grow just fine without feeding. But I'm not saying it doesn't help growth, and in my experience when I've used it regularly, I've had good growth. I couldn't say how much difference it's actually made, and I don't know if it would even be possible to measure that accurately, given you can't really show how the same coral would have done in the same conditions, except without Reef Energy Plus. But based on my anecdotal experience, I would personally recommend Reef Energy Plus if you want to maximise every last inch of growth, and if you're prepared to tolerate the trade-offs I'll discuss shortly. Aside from increased growth, Red Sea's other claims are that it improves health and coloration. In terms of health, I would agree based on my experience. The best example of that I can show you is this wall paint scolly. When I got it, it was on its last legs and was wasting away, but I target fed it with Reef Energy Plus every week or so and added Reef Energy Plus to the tank by a doser every day. And in a couple of months it went from looking like Callista Flockhart to looking like Beyonce. Since I've stopped regularly feeding Reef Energy Plus, its recovery has slowed down, and while it's still very much looking healthy, it's not yet become the puffy specimen I want it to, and I think I'd need to feed it more regularly if I wanted to achieve that. Now most of the other corals in my tank do look pretty healthy and show reasonable polyp extension most of the time, but they look just as healthy before I used Reef Energy. They look just as healthy when I stop using it, and they still look equally healthy when I dose the stuff intermittently. So I wouldn't personally say I noticed any general improvement throughout my tank, or that my corals showed better polyp extension. With the obvious exception of the Scolly that absolutely bloody loves the stuff. And I suspect other LPS corals may show similar benefits, although I have very few LPS corals in my tank. In my experience then, I'd say Reef Energy Plus will improve the health of at least some of your corals, but you might not actually notice any visual improvement in many corals, particularly SPS. And while I'm at it, my zoas don't look any better or worse when I use Reef Energy. The last of Red Sea's claims is that Reef Energy Plus improves coloration. Now you might think that some of the corals in these clips are showing very nice colours, and I generally agree. But coloration is the one area I personally haven't noticed any improvement whatsoever. In fact, I actually think some of my corals showed better colours before I started using the stuff than they do now, although I think that has more to do with my high nutrients than the Reef Energy, or anything else for that matter. Now, improved coloration was the one claim I thought was least likely to show true, and that has proven to be the case, at least to my eye. I think the theory is that a healthier coral will show better colours as a result, which sounds entirely plausible. But based on my own experiences, I personally wouldn't recommend using Reef Energy if improved colour is your main aim, and I'd say that in the majority of reef tanks, lighting, flow and maintaining stable parameters, particularly nitrate and phosphate, should be your first port of call if you're looking to improve your coral's colours. So what about the downsides I mentioned earlier, and why have I stopped using it so regularly? Well, while it's great you can put it on a doser and broadcast feed all of your corals at once, that does mean you're also feeding many undesirable organisms in your tank. And the times I stopped feeding Reef Energy Plus altogether were when I was trying to control my Aptasia anemone population that I didn't want to feed, when I had an outbreak of dinoflagellates that I suspected were benefiting from the amino acids, and most recently to try to get on top of my vermitid snail population. Vermitids in particular seem to get excited when I feed Reef Energy, and you can see them sweeping the water for food. I've also had high nutrients in my tank for quite a while now, with nitrate at over 20 parts per million and phosphate generally between 0.1 and 0.2 parts per million. I can't say I notice Reef Energy having any impact on that, but Red Sea do say to back off if you get high nutrients, so I suspect it might not have helped the situation. To be clear though, I had high nutrients before I used Reef Energy, and I still have high levels now, so I'm not blaming Reef Energy for that. But all in all, for me at least, the juice just isn't worth the squeeze. I like the idea of feeding my corals, but they get by absolutely fine without food. And I feel like Reef Energy Plus also feeds too many undesirables in my tank. In fact, I recently discovered this digitate hydroid thanks to an eagle-eyed viewer of one of my videos, and it's probably fair to assume this isn't the only one in my tank. Now, you'll often see coral farms feeding Reef Energy or similar products, which is part of what attracts me to the idea in the first place. But I've come to realise the goals of a coral farm are very different to my personal goals. I'm not really concerned with corals growing as fast as possible, but I do want them to look their best, and I haven't found Reef Energy Plus to make that much difference on the whole. And ultimately, I'm not prepared to accept an increase in my pest population for a little more growth, when the reality is that most corals, particularly SPS, will grow plenty fast enough if you just master basic water chemistry instead. I also found it a bit of a faff to set it up properly. To avoid waste, you ideally need to turn off your return pump when you dose so the Reef Energy doesn't end up in your skimmer or in your activated carbon. At first I set my return pump on a timer to switch off for 30 minutes while the Reef Energy spread, but that meant I also had to turn my skimmer off for the same amount of time to stop it overflowing. And I really don't like the idea of the extra wear and tear that will come from switching a return pump and a skimmer off and on hundreds of times a year. I also felt like the Reef Energy would probably clog up my activated carbon more quickly, reducing the polishing effect and meaning I have to change it out more often. It is worth noting I didn't see any impact on my skimmer when I was dosing Reef Energy. I generally turned it off for feeding, but I didn't always do so, and I didn't notice any obvious decrease in skimmer performance, either immediately or long term. And being able to add a week's supply at a time to a doser is really handy. I did find there was a little skin on the remains at the end of the week, but Reef Energy Plus didn't seem to go off after 7 days, even in hot weather. Well, what passes for hot weather here in the UK anyway? In summary then, I will still use Reef Energy, but only very sparingly, and I definitely won't go back to feeding daily on a doser. It seems like good stuff, and I'm happy it has a positive effect on my corals, but I find the cons of dosing every day outweigh the pros. And I think most people are far better off spending their time and money nailing the basics of stable water parameters, lighting and flow. To use Red Sea's recipe analogy, I see those as the key ingredients for a reef tank, and coral food is just the cherry on top of the icing on the cake.